Hello. So, I'm a big fan of science fiction and fantasy worlds, and I'm also a big fan of thinking about science fiction and fantasy worlds. And if you are too, and you're anything like me, you can probably relate to the experience of consuming some sort of piece of media that takes place in an otherworldly setting, and noticing some sort of recurring element in the world building or storytelling that kind of irritates you, or at the very least makes you stop for a moment and question the internal logic of this fictional universe. And so that's what this video is about. I'm going to talk at you for about 12 minutes about world-building things in fantasy and or science fiction settings that just kind of peeve me off. And that's simply what's going to happen. So let's jump into it. Number 1. Long-lived races. So, in most settings that include them, stock fantasy races like elves, gnomes, dwarves, and halflings all live several centuries longer than the real-world average human lifespan. The specifics vary from setting to setting, but generally elves are extremely long-lived, and dwarves and the other short guys might be a little less so, but can still far outlive the average mundane human. Similarly, in any sci-fi setting that includes a plethora of different alien races, at least one will probably be similarly long-lived. The Asari and Krogan from Mass Effect come to mind. I think the Vulcans in Star Trek live for a couple hundred years, and Yoda. This is interesting, right? Imagine for a moment there was someone today who was born 1,000 years ago. They could have witnessed the Norman conquest of England, the Mongol invasions, the Black Death, the Renaissance, the discovery and colonization of the Americas, the French Revolution, industrialization, the World Wars, and countless other historical events, and you could, talk to them. You could sit down and get a first-hand account of what William the Conqueror was like, the horrors of seeing countless friends and loved ones die to the Black Plague, or hear stories of some random medieval peasant named Rodolfo, who history has forgotten, but this 1,000-year-old person was friends with and was a really cool guy. Think of how different society would be if such people really existed, if they could impart on us their near-endless repository of historical knowledge, if they could share with us the boundless wisdom that they've accumulated over the course of over a dozen human lifetimes. Every aspect of how life works, how knowledge works, how civilization works, how decision-making works, would be fundamentally and completely changed. And that's why I think this trope annoys me, because in every work I've come across that includes it, I just don't think they explore this issue in a satisfying way. Sure, maybe you'll get some line from some self-righteous elf character about how his kind are so much better than humans because they live so much longer, or some melodramatic plot about two lovers from different species, one of whom will die long before the other even noticeably ages. But it's not really addressed, I feel. They never really explore the countless ways in which the world would be different due to the presence of these long-lived peoples. Society is by and large the same as you'd probably think it would be without the presence of these people. The reality of what having races of people that could live for centuries would mean is never taken to its logical conclusion. In the game Arcanum, which is a really good game by the way, and you should play it if you haven't, there is a historical character that is frequently mentioned called Nasruddin. He's sort of an elf Jesus. He's a hero from the Age of Legends, roughly 2,000 years before the game takes place. His life and times have become largely mythologized, and he's revered as a godly figure by many people you meet throughout the story. But 2,000 years is only 2 elf lifetimes. If we're really taking this into account, this seems like far too little an amount of time for him to become such a mythologized and legendary character. In fact, one of your potential companions, another elf, has a mother who lived during the Age of Legends and was a close personal friend of Nasruddin's. Think of how different Christianity would be. Think of how different conversations would be about the historical Jesus of Nazareth if your friend's mom knew him. But like most works of fantasy fiction that have long-lived races, this isn't really elaborated on or explored. And in fairness to the writers of these works, I don't think that's really their fault. I think it's probably because they can't really explore that adequately. We as humans can't comprehend what it'd be like to live so long. what exactly the world would really look like if these people existed. Even as I'm writing this segment, trying to convey how these authors fail to explore how society and the world would be different, I'm having trouble articulating what exactly I mean because I also don't know. Any author attempting to write about these things is doing so from a fundamentally flawed perspective, and so, as a result, long-lived races in fiction just tend to leave me very unsatisfied and a little annoyed. Number 2, the monoculture. There are roughly 200 independent nation-states in existence today. There are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world. Even in just one country, you can meet countless people of vastly different cultural backgrounds, personalities, ideological beliefs, and life experiences. Humanity is a mind-bogglingly diverse species. So, why is it that in basically every fantasy setting, there's just an elven language, and a dwarven language, and an orcish language, and that's that? Why don't these races have the same level of cultural diversity that human beings do in the real world? Does their entire species, every different groups throughout the whole entire setting, really just share one language? Is that language somehow genetic? When alien races appear in sci-fi, they too usually just have one language named for their species: Klingon, Vulcan, Huttese. These people come from planets presumably as large as Earth, yet they all share a singular native tongue. This isn't just related to language, you see this with culture too. This is what TelevisionTropes.net calls the planet of hats. This race is the race that follows this archetype, and every member of that race must conform to it. Every Klingon is violent and warlike, every Vulcan is austere and logical, every Ferengi is dishonest and greedy, and every Cardassian is daddy. I don't want to sit here and call this lazy. Creating a fictional world populated by a ton of different fictional races takes a ton of hard work, and if you tried to give every one of those races as much cultural and linguistic diversity as humans have in real life, that would take a lot of time and effort, and at least some of that would probably be better spent developing other aspects of the story and characters. And it's also true that, yeah, there are cultural stereotypes in real life, and a lot of those stereotypes are based partially in truth. If you're creating a fictional culture, starting with a simple archetype like the science race or the warrior race or the merchant race is absolutely fine as a jumping off point. It's just that when the writers never jump off from that point, that I kind of start to have a problem with it. I just think it's a shame when these characters start to feel less like real individual people and more like cardboard cutouts. It makes them seem so much smaller, less like a real species or even a real culture, and instead just a collection of basic stock elements. I think it would benefit a lot of stories to invest a little more effort in exploring the diversity of their fictional races. Have your alien species speak many different languages. You don't need to invent whole dictionaries for every single one, but maybe just mention it a couple of times. It doesn't have to be super in-depth, though it could be if you wanted it to, but just some indication that the races in sci-fi and fantasy worlds have a variance of cultures, nationalities, belief systems, etc., that reflect the diversity we see in our own world would be cool, I think. Number 3, the gods. So, with the previous two things I've talked about, I think that, at least partially, I have problems with these tropes for logical reasons. I mean, obviously most of this does come down to emotion. That's what a pet peeve is. That's what anything related to your subjective experience with a piece of art is. But still, I hope I at least made clear my intent to come up with a decent rationale for why I think long-lived races or completely homogeneous cultures often don't make a lot of sense to me within the context of these fictional worlds. This one is a little different. This is just something that I, personally, in my own opinion, don't like, and that is completely based on my own subjective taste. I don't really like gods in fantasy stories. Just point blank. I do not like it when there are literal gods that are proven to exist that interact with the world and the characters. I honestly think that, in the majority of cases anyway, it's just not very interesting. Part of this probably is informed by my own background. I am an atheist and have been for my entire life, So it makes sense to think I might not find these topics as relatable or engaging as would someone who was raised religious. But I am also someone who is very interested in religion. I like studying different religions and philosophies. I'm very interested in the history of religion, and I actually think that, more so than my own personal lack of belief, is what informs my dislike of the way gods are portrayed in fantasy fiction. Because the faiths we see in most fantasy stories are very different from what exists in real life. The most obvious being that these gods are proven to exist, and often actively meddle in day-to-day affairs. This immediately makes these stories a little harder to relate to, because, believer or non-believer, that's not reflective of our own experiences with religion. A devout Christian, for example, is devoted to his god because he has faith. But the gods of fantasy worlds don't require any faith. They simply exist, and everyone knows they exist, and you'd be a fool to claim otherwise. What's more, in real life, religions are, by and large, reflections of the societies that create them. In Neolithic societies, you had a goddess of the harvest, a god of rainfall, a god of thunderstorms, a god of war, etc. Things that directly related to the needs and wants and fears and day-to-day reality of the people at the time. As society grew and became more complex, religions and philosophies slowly evolved to accommodate these changes, to answer the abstract questions of life. How should society be run? What are the rules of morality and ethics? What should I do to live a fulfilling life? But in these fantasy worlds, religion doesn't have these purposes. Religion simply exists because these gods exist. They're these things, these freakish, all-powerful creatures that can do horrible things to you, and you better worship them or you're toast. And you might hear me say this and be like, okay, so what? It's a fictional story. It might not reflect how religion exists in real life, but this isn't real life. There's a ton of other things that also don't reflect real life, and you don't have a problem with that. And yeah, fair enough. I really don't have any good argument against that. Like I said, this is really just based on my own personal preference. I like stories about people. Ordinary people just doing stuff and creating their own destinies. I like fiction that is reflective of the amazing stories that happen in real life, and when the story stops being about everyday people that I can relate to, and starts being about these all-powerful deities that control everything, whose whims mere mortals are powerless to defy, that's just lame to me. So yeah, those were 3 gripes, 3 pet peeves, I'm not sure what I'm going to call this yet, about world building in fantasy and science fiction. I just want to clarify one last time that I'm not saying that the presence of any one of these tropes makes a work bad. In fact, I'm a big fan of pretty much every piece of media I've used as an example for this video. I just thought it would be interesting to give my thoughts on these common storytelling choices that kind of irk me sometimes. And if you have any thoughts on my thoughts, or if you have any world-building pet peeves of your own, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.